Coal is one of the biggest challenges in tackling the climate crisis. It is among the top 3 contributors of greenhouse gases, and the idea of a coal phase-out sounds like a much-needed proposition. But just on paper, the reality is that almost all of the world's developing nations depend on coal to meet their energy demands. And for them, eliminating coal entirely from the picture in the near future is a deal-breaker. Something similar happened at the COP26 Summit. India, the second most populous nation, the 7th biggest country, made a proposition to change the wording of the COP26 Pact, altering the words phase out of coal to phase down of coal. India's argument was simple and logical. Almost 50% of the country's energy comes from burning coal. But even with 17% of the world's population, it accounts for mere 5% of emissions, the lowest in per capita emission terms. According to data of the cumulative emissions per population in 1850 to 2021, while nations like Canada and the US topped the charts, peaking over 1,000 in terms of per capita emissions, India's per capita emissions, however, stand at 50.
A nation like India has a huge population, but with a very small carbon footprint per person there. And so there should be a flow of funds and resources for these nations such as India to deal with these impacts of climate change. Because it's just, the emissions from the US, from Australia, from some of these high-emitting, many European nations are getting their emissions down, but they've caused a lot of the climate change so far.
Even with one of the lowest emissions, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi pledged carbon neutrality by 2070. The timeline set a few decades further than developed nations, and the reasons for this are simple. India is still developing. Its people depend on coal. India, unlike the West, does not have oil or gas reserves to aid the switch. India spends more than $100 billion each year to import the fuels. It needs technology and funding to aid the transition, a request that has been ignored for quite some time.
India needs its power generation to be tripled by 2030. And rightly so, India has committed 50% of total power energy by 2030 will be from renewable. That itself a huge and steep target. It requires a lot of cheap finance and technology to be available to India. And we haven't seen any movement on commitment from the northern world on that request.
Western leaders made big pledges with embellished rhetoric in Glasgow. However, the ground reality is that India is the only G20 country which is on track of achieving the goals fixed under the Paris Agreement. It has been India's insistence for years that reducing the dependency on coal should take place in an equitable manner, taking into account the role of developed nations that have already released huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere because of their coal use in the past 2 centuries. India is a pioneer of the International Solar Alliance, and about 124 nations are part of the treaty spearheaded by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. India has been a key negotiator for a climate finance fund for the G77 countries. It does not differentiate between East or West. However, the impact is different. Island nations as well as developing nations have been facing the major brunt of it, while the developed West has been passing on the buck. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.